Welcome to the Tough Decisions Network. This is our special Sunday edition called Survive and Thrive with Dennae. Your host, Dennae Handford, will dive deep into chapter-by-chapter discussions on specifically selected books to help you make better decisions as an entrepreneur. Visit toughdecisions.net to sign up for our free weekly entrepreneur email. Before we get started, let's hear from one of our sponsors. Have you ever thought about investing in real estate, but find yourself so busy that you don't have time for it? Do you have FOMO, which is the fear of missing out? At HandfordCapital.com, we help investors with passive real estate investments that project better returns than traditional investment vehicles such as the stock market. If you'd like to find out more about our passive real estate investments, visit HandfordCapital.com. That's HANDFORD capital.com. We will jump on a call with you to discuss your investment goals and to see if our investments are a good fit for you. This advertisement is not to be construed as an offer or recommendation to buy or sell a security. Visit HandfordCapital.com.
Welcome to the Tough Decisions podcast, your Sunday edition with Dennae. We are talking about some of the most important concepts out of the book called How Children Succeed by Paul Tough. And the last couple of weeks, we have discussed the importance of non-cognitive skills. Last week, we reviewed the issues of motivation versus volition, and I talked to you a little bit about a researcher named Angela Duckworth, and I just mentioned her because in a couple of weeks, we'll come back to her and just mention briefly some of her research again. But today, I want to share with you some of the ideas out of Chapter 3 of Tough's book, which is titled How to Think. And to illustrate some of his points and talk about the issues here, he uses the example of an inner city chess team to illustrate the power of teaching kids how to think. Not just, thinking in class or learning a math concept or, learning history facts, although, that is part of it, but teaching them how to think about their challenges, about their mistakes, about their failures, and then eventually, of course, about life. That's where we want to carry this over to. And what he did was he went and he interviewed some students from an inner city chess team. It was IS 318 or Independent School 318 in New York, and their teacher or their coach named Elizabeth Spiegel. And what Spiegel did with this group of students is really quite remarkable, and I'm not going to be able to share all of the details with you here. He talks a lot about them in the book, but essentially Spiegel took this group of low-achieving students. They were from an inner-city school, low income, very low achieving as a whole, and she basically developed them into the most top middle school chess program in the entire country. Now, why is this significant? Well, as we'll discuss here again in just a second, IQ is generally associated with chess. Your ability to achieve at chess as a player has long been considered an indication of your IQ or your intelligence. And so it's one of those things that's somewhat associated with, higher income, higher level school districts where, for one, they have the funds to put into that kind of extracurricular activity, but they also are able to recruit teachers and students who are starting with a high IQ, if you will. What Spiegel did was transform this inner city middle school into the top performing chess program in the entire country. Again, on the middle school level. And that was just completely unheard of and very, very surprising that she was able to do that. Now, that explains why Tough has chosen this issue of the chess and why studying these chess players. Let's talk about what Spiegel did to create this transformation in this inner city middle school chess program. Tough describes how he would go to one of their weekend tournaments and sit and observe these students and their teacher. And what Spiegel would do after a match, particularly after a loss, but sometimes after a victory as well, she would get the student and she would pull them aside, and they had a procedure that they had discussed before time that all the students knew, and they would go aside to a room and they would reconstruct the game. And she would force them to think through every single move that they had made. And a lot of times they had written it down. They had a little notebook that they would carry around, and they would write down each move, the other team's move or the other person's move, as well as their own. And she would force them to look at each move and figure out where their mistake was made and figure out how things could have been played differently. As I mentioned, for years now, chess ability has been considered a strong indication of IQ. And one chess grandmaster went as far as writing an equation which he felt represented an accurate way of figuring out a person's IQ from their chess rating. The whole process is very complex, and it wouldn't help for me to even, give you the equation, how it's written out, because I'm not sure I understand totally, but essentially he would take a player's chess ranking and he had an equation where he could transform that chess ranking into what he said was an IQ or an intelligence quotient. However, there are those who disagree, saying that, the most important chess abilities are not intellectual. That should sound familiar by now, but the most important chess abilities are actually psychological and emotional. That should ring a bell. So while Spiegel often shared specific chess knowledge or strategy with her students in these post-game debriefings, what Tough observed in her post-game sessions was more than just chess information. She was, in essence, teaching her students how to think. She was expanding the capacity of their executive function. Remember that we discussed executive function, which occurs in the prefrontal lobe, and it's likened to an air traffic control center for the brain. It's where all of our complex upper level planning, strategizing, those kinds of skills occur. Her goal, as she states, was to help the students see and own their mistakes with the purpose of correcting them the next time. It's uncomfortable. Again, in her own words, she said, it's uncomfortable and it's not something that anyone really enjoys, but it's the only way to improve, is to get them to own that mistake and realize that they had complete control over it and they messed up. According to Spiegel, no one can get really good at chess simply by reading books on strategy. And for her, it's the perfect avenue to teach these skills because the game is entirely within their control. Unlike most other circumstances in life, remember that all of her students were from extremely difficult life circumstances. And so in a lot of cases, things were outside of their control and they had to learn to work within, for lack of a better word, the cards that they had been dealt. But in the case of chess, they had all the pieces that they needed to be successful. So when they messed up, they had no one to look to except themselves. And again, Spiegel said, it's uncomfortable. No one enjoys going through that, but it's the only way to improve, is to get them to evaluate and own those mistakes so that they won't make them the next time. Spiegel's job required and does require a delicate balancing act between positive, confidence-building strategies with the students, because she doesn't want them to go into the next match feeling defeated, all while pointing out where and how they were wrong and why it was their fault that they lost. So you can see this is a delicate act here that she's having to carry out. Now, another concept discussed by Tough in this chapter is the concept of falsification. This has been demonstrated to be one of the most important skills of a really good chess player. At this point, I know it may feel like I'm skipping around a little bit, but I hope to come back at the end and kind of pull things together. This concept of falsification, research, which I can't go into detail here, but again, it's all laid out in the book, has illustrated that master chess players, they don't have particularly stellar visual memories. In other words, when they're playing from one game to the next, it's not that they can remember what happened the last time, or they can remember where all the pieces were when they made this mistake or that mistake. They don't have these, photographic memories. And research has also shown that they don't calculate potential outcomes any better than an average chess player. And again, I might not be the right person to discuss all of this because I'm not any great at chess. I mean, I know what the pieces can do, and I've played, a few games here and there, but that's about it. But something that they do extremely well is a process called falsification. What is falsification? Well, let me illustrate. I'll explain what it is to kind of clarify things. Most people instinctively look for scenarios that support or validate their working theory. This is called confirmation bias. So in the realm of science, there's actually no way to prove that something is 100% correct. There's no way to really truly verify 100% scientific theories. The only way to test a scientific theory was to try things to prove it wrong. And this was a process called falsification. We'll carry that over into the chess world. These chess players, what they were really good at was coming up with an idea and then looking for reasons why that won't work. And we all struggle, I think, with this issue of confirmation bias. And it's something that actually Dana and I have talked about on a podcast before, where, I've talked about how I sometimes get frustrated when people shy away from a difficult discussion and they don't want to hear opposing points of view. And they can, say a lot of different things about why that might be. But a lot of times I think that it's, this feel-good, optimistic view of life, and they don't want to hear what could be around the corner, or they don't want to hear, the problems with their plans. And, I'm, I think, a fairly normal person, and I don't necessarily like hearing a pessimistic view of life either. But in some situations, particularly when you're trying to make a decision on moving forward, a pessimistic view of things can be helpful. And what they found was that the really good chess players were really good at identifying traps that could be around the corner. And they were better at this process of falsification than the average person. Now, I'm not necessarily promoting a pessimistic Eeyore style view of life. But what I am saying is that we should probably get over our own ego when it comes to hearing about potential problems and hearing about potential pitfalls, and realize that if we can put ourselves in a position where we can look for these issues ahead of time, then we can actually do a better job of preventing them. Now, I got a little bit off track, so let me get back, and I want to read you just a short excerpt from the book because I think it illustrates this idea of confirmation bias really well. In 1960, an English psychologist and, as it happens, a chess enthusiast named Peter Cathcart-Wasson came up with an ingenious experiment to demonstrate our natural tendency to confirm rather than disprove our own ideas. Subjects were told that they would be given a series of 3 numbers that followed a certain rule known only to the experimenter. Their assignment was to figure out what the rule was, which they could do by offering the experimenter other strings of 3 numbers and asking him whether or not these new strings met the rule. The string of numbers the subjects were given was quite simple: 2, 4, 6. Now, that was the first, I'm inserting here my own ideas, that was the first string of numbers they were given. And when I give you that string of numbers, you probably immediately, your mind begins to jump as to what could be the rule that these numbers are following. So let's try it. What's your first instinct about the rule governing these numbers? And what's another string you might test with the experimenter in order to find out if your guess is right? If you're like most people, your first instinct is that the rule is ascending even numbers, or numbers increasing by 2. And so you guess something like 8, 10, 12. And the experimenter says, yes, that string of numbers also meets the rule. And your confidence rises. To confirm your brilliance, you test one more possibility, just as due diligence. Something like 20, 22, 24. Yes, says the experimenter, another surge of dopamine, and you proudly make your guess. The rule is even numbers ascending in 2s. No, says the experimenter. Now, again, let's stop. What's the problem? These strings of numbers, all of them have only tested to confirm what we already thought the rule was. It turns out that the rule is any ascending numbers. So 8, 10, 12 does fit the rule. It's true, but so does 1, 2, 3, or 4, 23, 512. The only way to win the game is to guess strings of numbers that would prove your beloved hypothesis wrong. And that's something each of us is constitutionally driven to avoid. Now, I think that really well illustrates the issue that we're talking about here. We as humans have this tendency to want to confirm and congratulate and pat ourselves on the back. So what do? We continue, and we probably would continue to guess those strings of numbers that would prove our theory was correct. We don't look for and try to guess numbers that would disprove our theory and then thus enable us to specify and get down to what the actual rule was. The same tendency is a huge problem for chess players, and I think people in general. We all tend to look for examples that validate what we already want to do. But if we can learn to think about and look for scenarios that falsify our choice, or in a word, if we can be more pessimistic, then we can use this way of thinking to make better choices. And again, I quote from the chapter, expert players analyze their positions more accurately than the novices. They were able to falsify their hypotheses and thus avoid deadly traps. And I actually think you could just lift that sentence out of the book and transfer it into a business leader's book and be very well at home there. Expert players, expert leaders analyze their positions more accurately than the novices, and they're able to falsify their hypotheses and thus avoid deadly traps that might be in their future. So what are the takeaways? 2 questions. Do we practice reviewing our mistakes and figuring out what could have, should have been done differently? Do we practice what Spiegel forced her students to do, which is face their mistakes face to face, own those mistakes, and figure out how to change them and do differently the next time? Not in a way that keeps us down or discouraged, because again, remember, she was practicing this delicate balancing act of giving them confidence and building their confidence, all while telling them, hey, if you lost, it's your own fault. So we can't do it in a way that keeps us down or discouraged, but in a way that helps us own the mistakes so that things can be done differently the next time. And the second question is, are you any good at falsification? Maybe you're not any good. Maybe you've never even thought about practicing falsification like that. I kind of think most people are not naturally skilled at this, but I also think it's a useful way of thinking. It's a valuable way of thinking and something that we should add to our decision-making process. And we all, as Dan and I've discussed with many entrepreneurs on our show, we all kind of have a process that we go through when we're making decisions. I think falsification would be a good thing to add to that thinking process, because it can help us if we'll just be open to looking at something that contradicts what we want to do and contradicts what our choice may be, then we can really open ourselves up to seeing a whole different side of things. And again, not in a discouraging or depressing or, oh, I can't do anything that's going to come out right kind of way, but looking at what those potential pitfalls in the future might be and consider at least another way of looking at things. So next week, we'll jump into chapter 4. There's some important concepts there, and we're looking at about 2 more weeks of discussion. And then I'm really excited to let you know that on the last Sunday of November, November 25th, we're going to hear from Dr. Brian Anderson. And I was able to interview and talk with him just a few days ago and record our session. And I really think you'll appreciate his experience. He has a lot more experience in this field than I do. And so he was able to share some things from his own personal experience, some interesting things that he has discovered in his research and observed. And so I really think you'll appreciate hearing from him. So that's coming up at the end of the month. Until then, have a good week, and we'll talk next week on Chapter 4 of How Children Succeed.
Thank you for listening to the Tough Decisions Network. Be sure to visit toughdecisions.net to gain access to show notes for this episode and to join our free weekly entrepreneur email, where we will send you news about the latest technology for your business, inspiring quotes, and the latest books for entrepreneurs. That's toughdecisions.net.